Jake Sullivan walked past every woman in Copper Creek like they were invisible. Saloon girls with painted faces and low-cut dresses tried to catch his eye from the porch of the Silver Dollar. The shopkeeper's twin daughters always happened to be sweeping their front steps when he rode by. Even Mary Beth, the preacher's pretty niece, would wave her handkerchief and call out sweet hellos. But Jake's steely blue eyes never turned. His jaw stayed set. His horse kept moving. The whole town whispered about it. Some said the war had broken something inside him. Others claimed he'd sworn off love entirely after losing too many friends at Gettysburg. The older women clicked their tongues and said it was a shame to waste such a fine-looking man. But they were all wrong. Jake wasn't ignoring women because he didn't want one. He was ignoring them because he was looking for someone specific. Someone he'd lost. Someone he'd been searching for across 3 states and 2 long, bitter years. And on this dusty Tuesday morning in September, as he rode down Main Street with his usual stone-faced indifference, he was about to find her. The sun hung low, casting long shadows between the wooden buildings. Dust kicked up from his horse's hooves, settling on his worn leather chaps and the brim of his black hat. Jake's shoulders were broad from years of ranch work, his hands steady on the reins from countless miles in the saddle. At 32, he carried himself like a man who'd seen too much but hadn't given up hope. Not yet. He passed Murphy's General Store, the barber shop with its red and white pole, the small church where Sunday sermons echoed across the valley. His eyes scanned each face out of habit, the same ritual he'd performed in dozens of towns. Looking, always looking, never finding. Then he saw her. The woman was sweeping the front steps of Johnson's boarding house, her movements careful and precise. She wore a simple blue dress with a white apron, her dark hair pinned up in a neat bun with a few loose strands catching the morning light. Something about the curve of her neck, the way she held her shoulders, made Jake's breath catch in his throat. His horse stopped dead in the middle of the street. Not because Jake pulled the reins, because his hands went completely slack, the leather straps falling loose as every muscle in his body forgot how to work. The woman looked up at the sound of hooves on packed dirt. Her face turned toward him, and Jake Sullivan's heart, which had been as still as winter for 2 years, suddenly remembered how to race. Brown eyes, soft and warm like honey in sunlight. The same eyes that had looked at him with love on a spring morning in Kansas. The same eyes that had sparkled when he'd slipped the engagement ring onto her finger. The same eyes he'd seen in his dreams every night for 730 days. Margaret. But those familiar eyes held no recognition, no spark of memory, no joy at seeing the man she'd once promised to marry. She looked at him the way a person looks at a stranger, curious, maybe a little wary, but nothing more. Jake's throat closed up tight. His vision blurred at the edges. 2 years of searching, 2 years of hoping, 2 years of following every rumor and chasing every lead had brought him to this moment. She was alive. She was right here, not 20 feet away, real as the dusty ground beneath his horse. But she didn't know him at all. "You all right, mister?" Her voice was exactly the same, soft with just a hint of steel underneath, the way she'd sound when she was worried but try not to show it. "Your horse seems spooked." Jake forced his mouth to work. I'm fine." The words came out rough, like he hadn't spoken in months. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Just thought I recognized you is all." She tilted her head, studying his face with polite interest. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Mary." She paused, then added with a small smile, "Mary Thompson. I work here at the boarding house." Mary, not Margaret, and Thompson, not the maiden name he remembered. Jake felt like someone had punched him in the gut. Around them, the normal sounds of the town had gone quiet. Old Pete, who usually sat whittling on the bench outside the general store, had stopped his knife mid-cut. Sarah Collins had frozen halfway through hanging her laundry. Even the dogs seemed to sense something unusual was happening. Jake Sullivan, the man who wouldn't give any woman a second glance, was sitting stock still in the middle of Main Street, staring at the boarding house girl like he'd seen a ghost. "I'm Jake," he managed. "Jake Sullivan." He waited for some flicker of recognition, some sign that the name meant something to her. Nothing. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, if you're looking for a room, we've got one available. Clean sheets, good meals, fair price." She went back to her sweeping, dismissing him as easily as she might shoo away a stray cat. Jake climbed down from his horse slowly, his legs unsteady. "A room sounds good." His voice was getting stronger, but inside he was falling apart. "I'll be staying a while." "How long is a while?" She didn't look up from the steps. "Don't know yet. Until I figure out what happened to you. Until I understand why you don't remember. Until I find a way to bring you back. Could be weeks. Maybe longer." Now she did look up, and Jake caught something in her expression. A tiny frown, like she was trying to remember something just out of reach. "Have we met before, Mr. Sullivan?" "There's something." Hope flared in his chest like a struck match. "Maybe we have." But then she shook her head, and the moment passed. "No, I'd remember. I've got a good memory for faces." She finished the last step and straightened up. "You can talk to Mr. Johnson about the room. He's inside." Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky was still clear. At the sound, Mary, went perfectly still. The broom handle trembled in her grip, and all the color drained from her face. "Storm coming," Jake said softly, watching her reaction. Her breath came quick and shallow. I should get inside." She turned toward the door, stumbling slightly. "Ma'am, you okay?" She spun back toward him, and for just a second, her eyes were wide with something that might have been recognition, or might have been fear. "I know that sound," she whispered, so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "But I don't know why." The thunder rumbled again, closer this time. Mary Thompson pressed her hand to her forehead, swaying on her feet like she might faint. Jake stepped forward instinctively, reaching out to steady her. "Easy there." Their hands touched for just a moment. Her skin was warm, familiar, exactly the way he remembered. But she jerked away like she'd been burned. "Who are you?" she asked, but her voice was strange, distant, like she was asking the question of herself as much as him. Before Jake could answer, she turned and ran inside, the boarding house door slamming shut behind her. Jake stood alone in the street, holding the reins of his patient horse, while the first fat raindrops began to fall. Around him, the town slowly came back to life. People resumed their conversations, their work, their daily routines. But everything had changed. He'd found her. After 2 years, 3 states, and more miles than he could count, Margaret was alive. She was here. But the woman who'd just run from him wasn't the same person who disappeared from their wedding bed 2 years ago. Something had happened to her. Something bad enough to steal her memory and change her name. Something that made her afraid of thunder and strangers' touch. Jake Sullivan had spent 2 years learning to track, to hunt, to never give up. Now he had a new job to do. He had to find out what had happened to the woman he loved. And then he had to find a way to bring her home. The storm hit Copper Creek like a hammer blow. What had started as distant thunder became a full-blown tempest in minutes. Rain lashed against the boarding house windows, and lightning split the dark sky in jagged white lines. The wind howled through the streets, rattling shutters and sending loose papers flying. Jake sat in the small front parlor, pretending to read a 2-day-old newspaper while watching the stairs. Mr. Johnson, a thin man with kind eyes, had given him the room at the end of the hall on the 2nd floor. The same floor where Mary Thompson lived, though Jake hadn't mentioned that coincidence. The other boarders had gathered in the parlor to wait out the storm. Old Mrs. Patterson worked on her knitting. Young Tommy Fletcher played checkers by himself in the corner. But Mary was nowhere to be seen. Another crack of thunder shook the building, and from somewhere upstairs came a sound that made Jake's blood run cold. A woman's scream. High, terrified, and heartbreakingly familiar. He took the stairs 3 at a time. The sound was coming from behind the 3rd door on the left. Jake didn't bother knocking. He turned the handle and rushed inside. Mary Thompson sat in the corner of her small room, knees pulled up to her chest, rocking back and forth. Her hair had come loose from its neat bun, falling around her shoulders in dark waves. Tears streamed down her face, and she was making small, broken sounds like a wounded animal. "No, no, no," she whispered. "Please don't. Please stop." Jake knelt beside her, careful not to touch. "Mary, it's Jake. You're safe." Her eyes were wide and unfocused, seeing something that wasn't there. "There's so much blood," she gasped. I can't get away. He won't stop." Lightning flashed again, illuminating her terrified face, and suddenly she was looking right at him. "Margaret," Jake said softly. "Your name is Margaret." She went perfectly still. "What did you call me?" "Margaret Elena Ross. You were born in St. Louis. Your father sold hardware, and your mother made the best apple pie in Missouri." Jake's voice was gentle but sure. "You moved to Millfield, Kansas when you were 19. That's where we met." "I don't know what you're talking about." But her voice shook, and her hand went to her throat like she was feeling for something that wasn't there. "My name is Mary Thompson. I came here from." She frowned, struggling. "I can't remember where I came from." "You wore a silver locket," Jake continued. "It had your mother's picture inside. You used to fidget with it when you were nervous, just like you're doing now." Her hand dropped away from her throat like it had been burned. "How do you know that?" Jake reached slowly into his vest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small diamond that caught the lamplight. "Because I gave you this 2 years ago. We were going to be married on September 15th, 1880. Margaret stared at the ring like it was a snake. "That's impossible. I would remember getting engaged. I would remember you." "Look at it," Jake said, holding the box out to her. "Really look." She took the box with trembling fingers. The moment she touched the ring, her breath hitched. Her eyes went distant again, but this time she wasn't seeing terror. She was seeing something else, something that made her face soften with wonder. "There was a picnic," she whispered, "by a creek. You were nervous, kept stumbling over your words." She looked up at him with amazement. "You got down on one knee and the ring box fell in the mud." Jake's throat tightened. "You laughed so hard you nearly fell over." Said yes before I could even get the words out. "The dress," she said suddenly. "I was making a dress, white with little pearl buttons. I sewed them on myself." Tears were flowing again, but different tears now. "Oh God, Jake, it really is you. It's me, Maggie." He hadn't called her that in 2 years. "I've been looking for you everywhere." She launched herself into his arms then, and he held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. She felt exactly the same, warm and real and perfect. For a moment, it was like the last 2 years had never happened. But then she pulled back, confusion replacing recognition. "I remember pieces, flashes. But there are holes, Jake. Big holes where nothing makes sense." She touched her temple. "Sometimes I get terrible headaches. And the nightmares." "What happened to you?" Jake asked. "The night before our wedding, you were staying at Mrs. Miller's house. When I came to get you the next morning, you were gone. There was blood on the porch. Signs of a struggle. The sheriff said." "Said what?" "That you were probably dead, taken by bandits or wild animals." Jake's jaw clenched. "But I never believed it. I couldn't. I would have felt it if you were gone." Margaret shook her head slowly. "I don't remember Mrs. Miller's house. I don't remember our wedding. The first thing I remember clearly is waking up in a convent in Colorado. The sister said a wagon driver found me on the road, hurt bad. Head injury. I couldn't remember my own name. How long ago? About 1.5 years. I stayed there until I was well enough to work. Then I came here." She looked around the small room. "I've been Mary Thompson for so long. Sometimes Margaret feels like someone else's name." Another flash of lightning lit up the sky, but this time Margaret didn't flinch. She was too focused on Jake's face, searching for more memories. "You have a scar," she said, reaching up to touch a thin white line along his jaw. "From when your brother dared you to ride that mean stallion. You remember that?" "I'm starting to." Her fingers traced the familiar line. "Your hands. I remember your hands." She took his hand in hers, studying the calluses and scars. You built things. A house. You were building us a house. Still building it, Jake said quietly. Never stopped. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, her hand in his, both of them afraid to move and break whatever spell was bringing her memories back. Then footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Heavy boots. Confidence dried. The sound made Margaret tense up, though she couldn't say why. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. 3 sharp knocks. "Mary," a man's voice called. Deep, smooth, with an edge that made Jake's instincts prickle. "Mary, darling, are you all right?" Mrs. Patterson said she heard screaming. Margaret went white as fresh snow. Her grip on Jake's hand tightened so hard her nails bit into his skin. "I know that voice," she whispered, terror creeping back in her eyes. "Oh God, Jake, I know that voice." The doorknob turned slowly, and Clayton Marsh stepped into the room. He was a big man, well-dressed in an expensive suit with a gold watch chain. Handsome in a cold way, with steel gray eyes and perfectly groomed hair. The kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted. His gaze took in the scene. Margaret on the floor, Jake kneeling beside her, the intimate way they were holding hands. His face darkened. Well, Clayton said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "What do we have here?" Margaret couldn't speak. She was staring at Clayton like she was seeing a ghost. Or maybe a demon. Clayton's eyes fixed on her face, studying her reaction. Then a slow, terrible smile spread across his features. "I thought you were dead, my dear," he said softly. "What a pleasant surprise to find out I was wrong." At those words, everything came flooding back. Margaret's scream echoed through the boarding house, raw and full of remembered terror. And Jake Sullivan realized that finding his lost love was just the beginning of his problems. Because now he knew exactly what had happened to her 2 years ago. Margaret's scream died in her throat, but her whole body shook like a leaf in the wind. Jake moved closer, putting himself between her and Clayton Marsh. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, ready for a fight. "Get out," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. Clayton chuckled, stepping further into the room without invitation. Now, is that any way to greet an old friend?" He looked past Jake to Margaret, who was pressed against the wall like a trapped animal. "Hello, Margaret. It's been a long time." At the sound of her real name from Clayton's lips, the last of Margaret's buried memories came crashing back like a dam bursting. She saw it all with horrible clarity now. The night before her wedding, she'd been staying at Mrs. Miller's boarding house, as was proper for an unmarried woman. Jake had gone home to his ranch to prepare for the morning ceremony. Margaret had been sitting on the front porch, too excited to sleep when Clayton had arrived. "You remember now, don't you, darling?" Clayton's voice was silk wrapped around steel. "I can see it in your eyes." Margaret's voice came out in a broken whisper. "You said you loved me. Said Jake wasn't good enough for someone like me. And you turned me down," Clayton replied, straightening his cufflinks like they were discussing the weather. "Most ungratefully, I might add, after all I'd done for this town, all the opportunities I'd offered you." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "What did you do to her?" Clayton ignored him, focused entirely on Margaret. "You actually had the nerve to say you'd rather marry a dirt-poor cowboy than accept my generous proposal. Me, Clayton Marsh, one of the richest men in 3 counties. The memory was crystal clear now. Margaret could see Clayton's face changing from charming to ugly when she'd refused him. "You grabbed me," she said, her voice getting stronger with anger. "When I tried to go inside, you wouldn't let me. I simply tried to make you see reason. You hit me." The words exploded out of her. "When I screamed for help, you hit me across the face. Then you—" She couldn't finish, but she didn't have to. Jake saw red. He lunged forward, but Clayton was ready for him. The bigger man pulled out a small derringer from his vest pocket, pointing it straight at Margaret. Clayton said. "Let's keep this civilized, shall we?" Jake forced himself to stop, hands raised. "Easy now. Much better." Clayton kept the gun trained on Margaret while he talked. You see, Jake, your dear Margaret didn't just turn down my marriage proposal. She threatened to tell everyone in town about my methods of persuasion. Said she'd ruin my reputation. Margaret's face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady now. So you try to kill me. I try to make you understand that crossing Clayton Marsh has consequences. But you always were stubborn. He sighed dramatically. When you hit your head on those porch steps, I thought the problem had solved itself. There was so much blood. You weren't moving. I assumed you were dead. Jake's stomach turned. You left her there to die. I disposed of what I thought was a body, Clayton corrected. Took you out to the woods, dumped you in a ravine. Figured the animals would take care of the rest. He shrugged. Imagine my surprise when I heard rumors about a woman matching your description working at this very boarding house. Margaret wiped her tears away, and Jake saw something he recognized in her face. The same steel that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. But I didn't die, she said. I crawled out of that ravine, made it to the road somehow, and I survived. More's the pity, Clayton replied coldly. But we can fix that oversight tonight. Why? Jake asked, still trying to keep Clayton talking, looking for an opening. It's been 2 years. She doesn't remember everything. You could have just left her alone. Clayton laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. Because she's starting to remember. And because now she's got you sniffing around, asking questions. I built quite a nice life for myself here in Copper Creek. Respect, power, influence. I won't have it destroyed by a woman who should have stayed dead. The boarding house had gone quiet. Too quiet. Jake realized that Clayton's voice had been carrying, and the other residents had probably heard every word. Good. Let them know what kind of man they've been bowing and scraping to. Besides, Clayton continued, I've grown quite fond of this town. The people here understand proper order. They know their place. When I tell them that Jake Sullivan murdered poor Mary Thompson in a jealous rage before taking his own life, they'll believe me. After all, who's going to question Clayton Marsh? Margaret stood up slowly, using the wall for support. You're wrong about one thing, Clayton. Oh, and what's that? I'm not the same woman you attacked 2 years ago. Her voice was stronger now, filled with quiet fury. That woman was scared and sheltered. She never faced real hardship. But I've spent 2 years learning how to survive, learning how to fight. Clayton's smile faltered slightly. Big words from someone who's about to die. Maybe, Margaret said, but I'm not going quietly this time. And I'm not going alone. As if on cue, the floorboards in the hallway creaked. Clayton spun toward the door, and in that split second of distraction, Jake moved. He dove forward, tackling Clayton around the waist. The Derringer went off, the bullet splintering the wooden wall inches from Margaret's head. The two men crashed to the floor, fighting for control of the weapon. Clayton was bigger, but Jake was desperate. And more than that, he was fighting for the woman he loved. The woman he'd already lost once and refused to lose again. Margaret didn't scream or cower. Instead, she grabbed the heavy ceramic water pitcher from her washstand and brought it down hard on Clayton's wrist. He howled in pain and dropped the gun. Jake rolled away and came up with the Derringer in his hand, pointing it at Clayton's chest. Don't move, he panted. Clayton lay on the floor, clutching his wrist, his perfect hair mussed and his expensive suit torn. For the first time since he'd walked into the room, he looked less than completely in control. You can't prove anything, he snarled. It's her word against mine. And who's going to believe the word of a woman who can't even remember her own name? I will. The voice came from the doorway. Mr. Johnson stood there, his kind face hard as granite. Behind him crowded Mrs. Patterson, Tommy Fletcher, and several other townspeople. They'd heard everything. We all will, added Mrs. Patterson, her knitting needles clutched in her hands like weapons. Clayton's face went through several emotions: surprise, calculation, and finally, rage. You fools, he spat. I own half this town. I can destroy any one of you. Not anymore. You can't, came another voice. Sheriff Bill Hawkins pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun belt. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Clayton Marsh," he said formally, "you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Margaret Ross and the assault of a citizen in my town." "You can't be serious, Bill. We've known each other for years." The sheriff's expression didn't change. "I'm dead serious. And it's Sheriff Hawkins to you." He looked at Jake. "You can put that gun down now, son. I'll take it from here." Jake lowered the Derringer, but didn't let go of it. He tried to kill her twice. He's not getting a third chance. "No," Sheriff Hawkins agreed, pulling out his handcuffs. "He's not." As the sheriff hauled Clayton to his feet, the defeated man looked back at Margaret one last time. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "I have friends. Influence. Money can buy a lot of things, including freedom." Margaret stepped forward, no longer the frightened woman who'd been cowering in the corner. "Then you'd better use all of it," she said, her voice steady as rock. "Because I remember everything now. Every detail. Every moment. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." Clayton's face twisted with fury, but the sheriff was already pushing him toward the door. "Save it for the judge," Hawkins said, as the crowd began to disperse. Murmuring among themselves about what they'd witnessed, Jake and Margaret found themselves alone again. The room felt different now. Smaller, quieter, but somehow safer. "It's really over?" Margaret asked. Jake looked out the window, where he could see the sheriff loading Clayton into a wagon. "It's over." She sank down onto her narrow bed, suddenly exhausted. "I can't believe I forgot. How'd I forget something so terrible?" "Your mind was protecting you," Jake said gently, sitting beside her. "Sometimes forgetting is the only way to survive." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, and Jake wrapped his arms around her. She felt so small, so fragile, but he knew better now. This woman had survived being murdered and left for dead. She built a new life from nothing. She was the strongest person he'd ever known. "What happens now?" she asked. Jake pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Now we figure out how to be us again. The real us." Outside, the storm was finally breaking. But inside the boarding house room, Jake Sullivan held Margaret Ross and knew that this time, nothing would tear them apart. At least, that's what he thought until Sheriff Hawkins appeared in the doorway again, his face grim. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but there's something you both need to know. Clayton's got 3 men waiting for him at the jail. Armed men. And they don't look like they're planning to let him stay locked up." The first light of dawn crept through the boarding house window as Jake methodically cleaned his Colt .45. Each movement was deliberate, practiced, muscle memory from countless mornings before battle during the war. But this time, the stakes weren't just his own life. This time, he was fighting for the woman he'd thought lost forever. Margaret sat beside him, her fingers tracing the scars on his weathered hands. "Tell me you won't do anything foolish," she whispered. "Define foolish," Jake replied, checking the cylinder one more time. "Because walking away while Clayton threatens you seems pretty foolish to me." She caught his hand, stilling it. "I mean, don't try to be a hero. Just come back to me." The irony wasn't lost on him. For 2 years, he'd been searching for her, ready to die in that quest. Now that he'd found her, he had everything to live for and everything to lose. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Peterson entered, his badge catching the lamplight. "Jake, I need to tell you something about Clayton." His weathered face was grim. "He's brought in 3 men from Cheyenne. Professional guns." Margaret's breath caught. 3 against 1? "That's not how it works," Jake said quietly. "Honor still means something out here, even to men like Clayton. It'll be 1-on-1. He looked at the sheriff. "You sure about this, Pete? You could just arrest him." Peterson shook his head. "With what proof? It's her word against his, and he owns half the territory. But if he draws first..." The sheriff let the implication hang. As Peterson left, more visitors arrived. Mrs. Henderson from the general store brought ammunition. Tom, a blacksmith, offered his rifle. Even shy Sarah from the saloon slipped in with a flask of whiskey and a whispered for courage. Word had spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. The untouchable Jake Sullivan, the man who'd ignored every woman in town, was finally fighting for love. And the mysterious Mary, now revealed as Margaret, had become their symbol of hope against Clayton's tyranny. Other women came to see me yesterday, Margaret said as she helped Jake strap on his gun belt. Clara, the doctor's daughter, Jenny from the hotel, they all had stories about Clayton. Her voice hardened, stories they were too afraid to tell before. Jake's jaw tightened. How many? Too many. She met his eyes. This isn't just about us anymore, is it? Never was, he replied. Men like Clayton, they're poison. They spread until someone stops them. By mid-morning, the entire town had gathered along Main Street. Children were shooed indoors, but their faces pressed against windows. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Men checked their own weapons, just in case. Clayton appeared at the north end of the street, dressed in his finest black suit like he was attending a funeral. Maybe his own, maybe Jake's. His 3 hired guns flanked him, but they stayed back. Even they understood the code. Jake emerged from the boarding house, Margaret at his side until the last possible moment. She pressed something into his hand, the engagement ring he'd carried for 2 years. For luck, she whispered. I don't need luck, he said, kissing her forehead. I need you to trust me. The church bell chimed 11:30. Half an hour until high noon. Clayton's voice carried across the dusty street. Last chance, Sullivan. Ride out now. Leave the woman and live to see another sunrise. Jake didn't respond. He simply walked to the center of Main Street, his spurs clicking against the packed earth. The wind picked up, stirring dust devils between the buildings. Margaret positioned herself on the boarding house porch, the evidence of Clayton's crimes clutched in her hands. Testimonies from other women, documents showing his illegal land grabs, proof of his corruption. If Jake fell, she would make sure the truth survived. The clock tower showed 11:55. Clayton strutted into the street, his hand resting casually on his pearl-handled pistol. You know, I'm going to enjoy breaking her in again after you're dead, Sullivan. Jake's hand moved closer to his gun, but he maintained control. Not yet. Not until noon. The wind died suddenly, leaving an eerie stillness. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, stamping nervously at their hitching posts. 11:59. Clayton's confident smirk faded as he realized Jake wasn't going to be goaded into drawing early. This would be a fair fight, after all. The church bell began to toll. Bong, bong, bong. On the 12th chime, 2 hands moved like lightning. Multiple gunshots rang out, echoing between the buildings like thunder. Smoke filled the street, obscuring everything. As the smoke began to clear slowly, Margaret screamed Jake's name. The smoke cleared like a curtain being drawn back on a stage, revealing the truth of what had transpired. Jake stood swaying but upright, his left shoulder dark with blood, his smoking Colt still in his right hand. 20 feet away, Clayton Marsh lay crumpled in the dust, his pearl-handled pistol unfired beside his outstretched hand. Margaret flew from the porch, her skirts billowing as she ran to Jake's side. You're alive, she gasped, catching him as he stumbled. Oh God, you're alive. Takes more than Clayton Marsh to put me down. Jake managed through gritted teeth, though his face was pale from blood loss. Dr. Matthews pushed through the gathering crowd, his medical bag in hand. Get him to my office. Now. But Clayton wasn't finished. With his dying breath, he rasped loud enough for the crowd to hear. Should have killed her that night, like I killed the others. His eyes found Margaret's face. You were supposed to die with the rest of my secrets. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Even in death, Clayton had revealed more than he intended. Sheriff Peterson knelt beside the body, then stood to face the townspeople. You all heard that, Peterson announced. Clayton Marsh just confessed to murder. Margaret, those testimonies you gathered, we'll need them for the territorial judge. 3 days later, Jake sat propped up in bed at Dr. Matthews' house, his shoulder bound but healing. Margaret rarely left his side, reading to him, bringing him soup, simply talking about their future in ways they'd never dared before. I remember everything now, she said one evening as the sun set through the window. Not just what Clayton did, but before that. Our plans, our dreams. She traced patterns on the quilt. We were so young then. We're different people now, Jake agreed. You're stronger than you ever were. And I learned what it means to really lose someone. She looked up at him. Do you think we can build something better than what we had before? Instead of answering with words, Jake reached into his vest pocket, the one the doctor hadn't cut away, and pulled out the engagement ring he'd carried for 2 years. But this time, he didn't simply present it. Margaret Collins, he said formally, I'm not the same man who proposed to you 2 years ago. I've seen too much, lost too much. And you're not the same woman who said yes. You're braver, stronger, more independent. He paused. So, I'm asking a new question. Will you marry me as the people we are now, as equal partners? Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the ring, no longer a symbol of what they'd lost, but what they could build together. Yes, she whispered, but this time we do it right. A real partnership. The town embraced their engagement with genuine joy. After years of living under Clayton's shadow of fear, Margaret's courage in speaking out had freed them all. Women who'd been silenced found their voices. Men who'd been intimidated stood taller. Mrs. Henderson insisted on making Margaret's wedding dress. Simple but elegant, she declared. A dress for a woman, not a girl. Tom the blacksmith crafted new horseshoes for Jake's horse. For good luck and strong foundations, he said with a grin. The church ladies organized the reception, but Margaret insisted on helping with the preparations. She was no longer content to be decorative. She wanted to be useful. 2 weeks later, as Margaret stood before her mirror in a boarding house, she saw someone completely different from the frightened girl who'd fled 2 years ago, or the lost woman who'd swept these very steps months ago. She saw a woman who'd faced her demons and won. Jake appeared in the doorway, handsome in his best suit, his arms still in a sling, but healing well. Ready to marry me, Miss Collins? She turned to him, radiant in her simple white dress, holding the wildflower bouquet she'd picked herself that morning. For the first time in years, her smile held no shadows. This time, she said, nothing will stop us. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline Wyoming sky that seemed to promise endless possibilities. Margaret stood at the window of her room in the boarding house, watching the town come alive. Children chased chickens in the street, while their mothers hung laundry that snapped like flags in the crisp autumn breeze. Mrs. Henderson bustled in with the wedding dress, her face glowing with maternal pride. Oh, my dear, you look radiant. Jake won't know what hit him. Margaret smiled, smoothing the simple ivory silk dress they'd made together. No elaborate bustle or excessive lace. This dress was designed for a woman who could ride, work, and stand as an equal partner beside her man. The only ornament was her grandmother's cameo brooch, pinned at the collar. Are you nervous? Asked Sarah from the saloon, who'd become an unexpected friend during the planning. Not nervous, Margaret replied, checking her reflection one final time. Excited. Ready. She paused, thinking of all they'd overcome. 2 years ago, I was marrying Jake because it seemed like the natural next step. Today, I'm marrying him because I can't imagine facing life without him. The church bells began to ring, calling the town to witness their union. Margaret gathered her wildflower bouquet, prairie roses, Indian paintbrush, and baby's breath that she'd picked at dawn from the meadow where Jake had proposed again, properly this time. At the church, Jake stood at the altar in his best dark suit, his left arm finally free of the sling, but still moving carefully. Sheriff Peterson served as his best man, while Dr. Matthews and Tom the blacksmith sat in the front row with grins wide enough to split their weathered faces. The church was packed, every pew filled with townspeople who'd watched their story unfold. From Jake's years of searching to Margaret's mysterious arrival, through the terror of Clayton's threats, and finally to this moment of triumph and new beginning. When the doors opened and Margaret appeared, walking alone by her own choice, A collective sigh went through the congregation. She moved down the aisle with confidence, her eyes never leaving Jake's face. This wasn't a nervous bride being given away. This was a woman choosing her destiny. Pastor Williams opened his worn Bible and smiled at the couple. Dearly beloved, we gather not just to witness a wedding, but a reunion. Jake and Margaret have traveled through darkness to find each other again. And in doing so, they've shown us all what true love means. Their vows were simple but profound. Jake spoke first, his voice steady and sure. Margaret, I searched for you across 3 states because I thought I'd lost my future. But I found something better. I found a woman who doesn't need my protection, but chooses my partnership. I promise to stand beside you, not above you, through whatever comes. Margaret's voice was clear as mountain water. Jake, I lost myself once, but in finding my way back, I discovered who I really am. I'm not the girl you fell in love with years ago. I'm stronger, I'm braver, and I love you not from need, but from choice. I promise to be your equal partner in all things. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Jake's kiss was tender but brief, a promise of the lifetime they now had together rather than desperate passion. The celebration that followed filled the church hall and spilled into the street. Mrs. Henderson had organized the women to create a feast that would be talked about for years. Tom the blacksmith played fiddle while his son accompanied on harmonica. Even the saloon girls joined in, their voices harmonizing on the old songs everyone knew by heart. As the sun began to set, Jake and Margaret slipped away from the festivities to walk alone through the quiet streets of Copper Creek. Their house, the one Jake had been building during her recovery, waited for them at the edge of town, small but perfect, with a front porch facing the mountains and a garden plot ready for spring planting. I keep thinking I'll wake up and find this is all a dream, Margaret said as they stood on their new threshold. If it is, then we're both having the same dream, Jake replied, lifting her easily despite his healing shoulder. And I never want to wake up. 6 months later, their life had settled into a rhythm that felt both new and eternal. Margaret had proven as capable with cattle as she was with keeping house, riding alongside Jake to check fence lines and move herds. She'd also started a small school in the church basement, teaching the town's children to read and write. Jake, meanwhile, had discovered that his military skills translated well to organizing the area ranchers for mutual protection and resource sharing. No more Clayton marshes would terrorize Copper Creek if he had anything to say about it. One evening in early spring, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Margaret took Jake's hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "We're going to need a bigger house," she said simply. Jake's eyes widened, then filled with a joy so pure it took her breath away. "Are you sure?" Dr. Matthews confirmed it this morning. She laughed at his stunned expression. The baby should arrive just before Christmas. A year later, Jake Sullivan walked down Main Street with his wife and 6-month-old son in her arms. The same women who'd once tried to catch his eye now smiled and waved warmly, not from romantic interest, but from genuine friendship. They all knew the story now, how love had triumphed over evil, how 2 people had found their way back to each other through darkness, how a town had learned to stand together against tyranny. Margaret shifted little Thomas to her other arm and looked at her husband with sparkling eyes. "Remember when you used to ignore every woman in this town?" Jake chuckled, his arm tightening around her waist. "I wasn't ignoring them. I was waiting for the right one." He kissed the top of her head as their son gurgled happily between them. Turns out she was worth the wait. As they reached their house, Margaret looked back at the thriving town, then up at her husband's face, and finally down at their son, their future growing stronger in her arms. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you were really looking for," she said softly. "And sometimes what you're looking for is exactly who you were meant to be." The sun set behind them as the Sullivan family went home together, their story complete, but their life together just beginning.